Welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to look at manipulating elements within our document. Specifically, we're going to look at manipulating the class attribute on the elements that we found in the last chapter. I'm going to give you a basic introduction to manipulating an HTML document, but you can learn more about this approach in Lesson 3 of the JavaScript Foundations course. So returning to our plan, there are 3 instances where I want to tweak the class assigned to the HTML element. Now we can access class values in a few different ways. If I define the variable class_names, that information could be extracted from the page using the class name attribute on the HTML element or any element within an HTML document. Or I could get it using .getAttribute and then pass in the attribute I'm looking for, in this case the text string class. The first is an instance of the HTML DOM API, and the second is what's referred to as a getter method. The first instance can be both read and written to. So if I were to say html.className equals foo, a text string foo, that would assign that value to the class, overriding anything that existed previously. GetAttribute, however, only gets the attribute value. It does not allow me to set that attribute value. To do that, I would have to use setAttribute, which is a setter method. Either of these approaches would get us the value of the class attribute as a string. Once we have that string, we can manipulate it in a number of different ways. Here's a simple example of concatenation, in this case using the plus equals syntax. Now what plus equals is equivalent to is saying class names is equal to class names plus equals space my new class name. I could write it out in that long form, or I could simply say class names plus equals space my new class name. So that's one way to append the value to the class names. The other is that I could split the class value on a space, since classes are space separated, and then I could push the new class name to that array, and then I could join that array back together again using a space. And that would convert it back to a string again. Either of these would work perfectly, but the second is just a little bit more surgical in how it does it. Now removing the class name is a little trickier. I could use string replacement to replace my new class name with an empty string, or I could use a regular expression in the second example here to replace my new class name with some sort of word boundary, which is either a space or a carriage return or the start or end of the overall string, with an empty string. The first is fairly straightforward. The second is a little bit more complicated, but if we want to get surgical about how we remove class names, we have to get a little craftier. So let me walk you through this code here. First of all, we have our class names variable, which I'm going to split on a space so that I have an array of class names. I'm then going to capture the length of that array as the len variable. And then I'm going to create a second variable called kept classes, which is going to be another array. It's going to be an empty array, which is what I'm saying there. Square brackets simply means empty array. And that array is what we're going to fill with the class names that we want to keep. Finally, I can loop through those class names. In this case, I'm iterating over the class names, working my way from the end of the class list to the start of the class list. That's what that minus minus does. It's decrementing the value of the length each time the loop is run. So if this particular element was to have 4 class names, the length would be 4. Len would be equal to 4. So when I say while len minus minus, that means that the length value would be decremented after that condition is evaluated. So within those curly braces, the gray text in between them, the value of len would actually be 3 because it had been reduced after it was evaluated. And as I went over, arrays are 0 indexed, which means that class names square bracket len, as you see in that next line, would actually be that 4th class name. It may seem a little bit weird, but once you wrap your head around zero-indexed arrays, it makes complete sense. So the while statement will actually run until the content of the parentheses evaluates as false. That bit in green is what's called a test condition. So as the loop is going, when it gets to that final class name whose index is 0, and it goes back to run the loop one last time, 0 would be inside of those parentheses, and 0 is what we call a falsy value. So it would return as though it was false. So it would be seen as though it was false, and the loop would stop. So within that while loop, we're going to test a condition. In this case, we're going to test to see if the current class name, so 4, 3, 2, 1, or simply 1 if there's only one class name, is not equal to my new class name. So in this case, if it is equal to my new class name, the gray text inside of the curly braces would be skipped over, would not be executed. But if the current class name was equal to my new class name, the contents of the if conditional would not be evaluated. But if the class name is not equal to my new class name, it would be evaluated and that class name would be pushed to the kept classes array. The exclamation point equals or bang equals operator is another comparison operator that we have to test to see if two things are equal. To find out more about operators, check out the JavaScript Foundations course. If that condition evaluates to true, the current class name is then pushed to the kept classes array. Finally, we go ahead and rejoin the kept classes and assign those back to the class names variable. Now that's an awful lot of code that we need to write each time we need to adjust the class name on a particular element. In order to make it a little bit more usable if we need to call it multiple times, as we do in the case of this particular script, we can abstract that to a function. In this case, I've created a function using the function declaration, and I've named it remove new class from HTML. Now you'll notice that the way that I've written the names of these functions is a little bit different than the variables you've seen before. In this case, I'm using camel case, which means starting with a lower letter, and then each subsequent word is run into the previous word and it's capitalized. Now the reason that I like this approach is that it makes it really easy for me to look at a variable and tell that it's a function. Additionally, I like to name them in a way that describes what they do. So in this case, remove new class from HTML or add new class to HTML. Now it's worth noting that when you create a function, that function becomes a method of the global object, which is the window object. So if you'll note, I've created those two functions in the first two lines, and then if I were to, in the console, say window.remove new class from HTML, it would return that function to me. So that's pretty good, but that particular function, remove new class from HTML, is pretty limited. It's just removing that class name from the HTML element. It would be better if I could create a more reusable function, such as remove class. Now, in order to make it work, I need to define that function to have two arguments: the element that I'm talking about and the class name that I want to remove from that element. With that set up in place, I can simply replace the references to the HTML element explicitly and that class name explicitly in order to achieve the exact same effect. And then I can simply say remove class, $HTML as the first argument, and then the class name that I want to remove as the second argument. And that makes it really easy to use it anywhere in our code. And then I could do the same thing for add class. Now, JavaScript is continuing to evolve just like CSS and HTML are, and in newer versions of JavaScript and more modern browsers, we actually have a full API to do all of this stuff natively, and we don't even have to write those functions. It's a lot easier. And the way that it does this is via the class list API. Now the class list is a collection of the class names assigned to that particular HTML element. And we have methods available to us to add, remove, toggle, which means to add if it doesn't exist in the class list already and remove if it does. And then we also have the ability to check and see if a particular class is contained within the class list. So all of these make it super easy to do things like add and remove class names from an element. So if I were to say, here's the HTML element, $HTML is equal to document.getElements by tag name, HTML square bracket 0. I can then create a variable page_classes, which is a reference to that class list. So page_classes is equal to HTML.classList. Then I could define a variable drawer_enabled_class that is equal to the class that I want to add and remove. Then I can simply say pageclasses.add drawer_enabled class, pageclasses.remove drawer_enabled class. Easy peasy. Now, because this is a newer API, we really should test to make sure that it's available before we use it. So I could simply say, if class list is not in document body, in other words, if the body element doesn't have a class list property, then I'm just going to return, which means I'm just going to exit this program gracefully. I'm not going to throw any errors for the user, but they don't get the enhancement. Now there's another instance where we'll need to use the class list API as well, and that's to add and remove the drawer opening class. For this next assignment, I'd like you to play around with manipulating elements on your page. So open up Chrome and open up the console, and then inspect an element in the Chrome DevTools using the DOM tool, and look at the other properties that you can read or write on the element. Try getting and setting them via the JavaScript console. Remember, get attribute and set attribute. Post your observations and thoughts in the forum. In this chapter, we covered inserting information into a web page, specifically manipulating the class attribute. In the next chapter, we're going to look at listening for user interactions and actually start to see the interface come together. I'll see you in a few minutes.